Padre Pio spent decades in the confessional listening to sins, thousands of confessions, tens of thousands. The same sins repeated week after week by the same people. Adultery confessed and committed again. Theft admitted and repeated. Lies acknowledged and told again. Anger confessed and expressed again. Year after year, the same patterns, the same failures, the same return to behaviors that wounded both the sinner and those around them. And yet Padre Pio never despaired over these souls, because he had discovered something that most people misunderstand about judgment and mercy. The discovery came not through mystical vision or divine revelation, but through careful observation over years of hearing confessions. He noticed a pattern that contradicted what many believed about sin and damnation. There were people who sinned grievously, repeatedly, almost compulsively. Their confessions were not lists of small faults, but admissions of serious moral failures. And yet Padre Pio knew, with certainty, that these souls were not destined for hell. Not because their sins were small, not because God was lenient, but because of one specific quality they possessed. A quality so simple that people overlook it, so ordinary that it seems insufficient, and yet so powerful that it changes everything. What Padre Pio discovered was this: the souls who never go to hell are not the ones who sin the least, the llamas, are the ones who never stop returning. Return is the word that matters. Not perfection, not sinlessness, not even dramatic conversion, but return, the act of coming back after falling. Again and again, without end. This is what separates the soul destined for mercy from the soul moving toward judgment. Not the severity of sin, but the persistence of return. He saw this most clearly in a woman who came to confession every week for 20 years. Every week she confessed the same sin, a pattern of anger toward her husband that erupted into cruelty. She would berate him, withhold affection, say things deliberately meant to wound. And every week she would confess it with genuine sorrow. And every week she would fall again. For 20 years this continued. 20 years of the same failure. 20 years of the same pattern. And many people observing this would have concluded that her confessions were meaningless, that nothing was changing, that she was simply going through motions without transformation. But Padre Pio saw something different. He saw that she kept coming back. That was the crucial detail. She never gave up, never stopped confessing, never made peace with her sin, never justified it or explained it away, never stopped being sorry. And that persistent return, that refusal to accept sin as permanent, that determination to keep acknowledging fault even when fault kept recurring, that was what saved her. Not because confession was magic, not because absolution erased consequences, but because the act of returning revealed the direction of her soul. Padre Pio understood that a soul is not judged by its worst moment. It is judged by its orientation. And orientation is revealed not in perfection, but in response to failure. Some souls, when they fail, stop returning. They decide that since they cannot overcome the sin, they will no longer fight it. They make peace with what defeats them. They justify what they cannot change. They create comfortable narratives that allow them to live with what they once knew was wrong. And slowly, imperceptibly, their orientation shifts. They stop moving toward God and start moving away, not dramatically, not through rebellion, but through resignation, through the quiet decision to stop trying. Other souls, when they fail, keep returning. They do not pretend the sin is smaller than it is. They do not excuse themselves. They do not lower their standards to match their behavior. Instead, they acknowledge failure fully and come back anyway. This is the pattern Padre Pio recognized as decisive. Not the absence of sin, but the presence of return. Not strength to avoid falling, but humility to keep rising. Not perfection, but persistence. What people misunderstand is that hell is not a punishment for sin itself. Many saints were great sinners before conversion. What determines damnation is not the sin committed, but the soul's response after committing it. Does the soul turn back or turn away? Does it acknowledge fault or justify it? Does it seek mercy or make peace with distance? These choices, made repeatedly over time, create direction, and direction determines destination. Padre Pio saw souls who committed what appeared to be smaller sins, yet moved steadily toward judgment, because after each small sin, they explained it away, made it reasonable, compared themselves favorably to worse sinners, protected their self-image, and never genuinely returned. They attended Mass, said prayers, received sacraments, but their souls were not actually turning back toward God. They were managing their religious obligations while maintaining comfortable distance. And that distance, though it felt safe, was slowly becoming permanent. Then there were souls who committed grave sins repeatedly. Sins that scandalized others, sins that seemed impossible to overcome. Yet these souls kept returning, kept confessing, kept acknowledging, kept trying. And Padre Pio knew that his souls were safe. Not because their sins didn't matter, not because God overlooked serious faults, but because their persistent return revealed something crucial about their hearts. They had not made peace with the sin. They had not adjusted their consciences to accommodate failure. They still recognized wrong as wrong, still desired to be different, still hoped for transformation even when transformation seemed impossible. This is what saves. Not the achievement of transformation, but the desire for it combined with the humility to keep seeking it. Padre Pio often said that God does not require us to be perfect. He requires us to be honest. Honest about what we are. Honest about what we have done. Honest about our need for mercy. And honest enough to keep returning. Even when returning feels pointless, because we have failed so many times before. The souls who go to hell are not necessarily those who sinned more. They are those who stopped returning, who decided at some point that the distance between what they are and what they should be was too great, who gave up on transformation, who made excuses until excuses became conviction, who practiced justification until they could no longer see their own need. These souls do not typically experience dramatic rebellion. They experience a gradual resignation, a slow, comfortable acceptance of spiritual mediocrity, a quiet decision to stop trying. What Padre Pio discovered is that this decision is more dangerous than any sin, because sin can be repented of. But the decision to stop repenting slowly closes the soul to the very mercy that could save it. A soul that keeps acknowledging fault remains open. A soul that stops acknowledging fault begins to harden. And hardness, when it becomes complete, becomes hell. He explained this to people who came feeling hopeless about their repeated failures. They would confess the same sins month after month, year after year. They felt their confessions were meaningless because behavior was not changing. They wondered if God was tired of forgiving them, if mercy had limits, if they had exhausted divine patience. And Padre Pio would tell them the truth that most needed to hear, that their persistent return was itself the sign of grace working, that their refusal to accept sin as permanent was evidence of a soul still oriented toward God, that their continued sorrow, even over repeated failure, was more important than they realized. This did not mean sin did not matter. It did not mean that repeated failure was acceptable, or that confession was permission to keep sinning. What it meant was that the direction of the soul matters more than the speed of progress. A soul moving toward God slowly is still moving toward God. A soul that falls and rises repeatedly is still rising. A soul that cannot yet overcome its sin but refuses to make peace with it is still aligned with truth. And these realities matter eternally. Padre Pio saw that many people create impossible standards for themselves. They believe that unless they achieve immediate and complete transformation, their repentance is false. Unless they never fall again after confessing, their confession meant nothing. Unless they can point to dramatic change, God must be disappointed. But this is not how grace works. Grace does not require perfection. It requires cooperation. And cooperation is shown not through sinlessness, but through return. The woman who confessed the same sin for 20 years did eventually change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. Her pattern of anger toward her husband slowly decreased in frequency and intensity. The eruptions became less severe. The words became less cruel. The periods between failures became longer. But this transformation took years. And if she had given up after the first 10 failures, or the 100th, or the 1000th, the transformation would never have occurred. What saved her was not that she finally succeeded. It was that she never stopped trying. And in that persistent trying, grace had room to work. This is the mystery Padre Pio understood about mercy. It is not limited by human failure. It is only limited by human refusal. A soul that keeps asking receives. A soul that keeps seeking finds. A soul that keeps returning arrives. Not immediately, not without struggle, but eventually. The souls who are lost are not those who sinned too much. They are those who stopped asking, stopped seeking, stopped returning, who decided they were beyond help or he didn't need it, who made peace with distance or justified their position, who stopped moving toward the light because the darkness became comfortable. What decides a soul's eternal fate is therefore not primarily about the gravity of sins committed, but about the response to those sins sustained over time. Not whether the soul fell, but whether it kept rising. Not whether it failed, but whether it acknowledged failure and sought mercy. Not whether it was weak, but whether it remained humble enough to admit weakness and ask for strength. These patterns practiced daily form the soul's deepest orientation. And that orientation continues beyond death. Padre Pio knew that some souls arrive at judgment having sinned greatly, but having never stopped returning. Their record is full of failure, but also full of repentance. They never achieved perfection, but they never accepted sin as inevitable. They never became comfortable with distance from God. And these souls, when they face judgment, find mercy waiting. Not because they earned it, but because they never stopped seeking it. And a soul that seeks mercy is a soul that can receive it. Other souls arrive at judgment having sinned less dramatically, but having quietly decided at some point that they were acceptable as they were. They maintained religious practices, but stopped allowing those practices to challenge them. They attended to obligations but protected themselves from transformation. They kept sin manageable rather than confronting it. They lowered expectations rather than reaching higher. And these souls, when they face judgment, discover that the distance they found comfortable in life has become permanent. Not because God pushed them away, but because they practiced distance until it became their nature. This is why Padre Pio told people to be more afraid of comfort than of failure. A soul that fails and knows it is failing can still turn. A soul that is comfortable is often a soul that has stopped turning. Failure that leads to repentance is safer than success that leads to pride. Weakness that leads to humility is safer than strength that leads to self-sufficiency. What matters is not how strong or how weak, how successful or how failing, but whether the soul remains open, teachable, willing to acknowledge need, willing to seek help, willing to return. The only reason some sinners never go to hell, despite great and repeated sins, is that they never stop returning. This simple truth changes everything about how judgment is understood. It means that hope is never lost while life continues. It means that no sin is unforgivable to the soul that genuinely seeks forgiveness. It means that the worst thing a soul can do is not to commit a grave sin, but to stop acknowledging sin and seeking mercy. Because the soul that stops returning has begun its final direction. And the soul that continues returning, no matter how many times it falls, has not yet chosen hell, has not yet closed itself to grace, has not yet decided that distance is preferable to the vulnerability of mercy. Padre Pio would end confessions not with assurance that the person would never sin again. He knew better. He would end with the instruction to return. When you fall, and you will fall, come back. Do not wait. Do not let shame keep you away. Do not let repeated failure convince you that mercy has limits. Come back. Always come back. That is what saves. Not the absence of falling, but the persistence of rising. Not perfection, but return. This is the only reason some sinners never see hell. Because despite everything, despite all their failures and all their weakness, they never stopped coming home.